Good evening. For those of you who I haven't had a chance to say hello to, I'm Jennifer Rabb and have the great privilege of being the president of Hunter College and to welcome you all to our East Harlem complex tonight. We're happy to have all of you here tonight on such an important topic, but a special welcome home to our former dean and always part of our family, David Steiner. We were sad to see him go to Johns Hopkins, but as they say in the marriage industry, you don't lose a daughter, you gain a son. So we didn't lose David, we gained a Johns Hopkins. And we are very lucky to have this synergy and to continue these incredibly important conversations. Also, our new partner now, Adam Gamoran, once in, Adam never out. So Hunter looks forward to a long partnership with you, with Vivian Sang, your vice president, and to congratulate the Grant Foundation, WT Grant Foundation, on the incredibly important work that you do. There can be no better and really perfect place than to have this conversation than Hunter College. This is our roots, this is our soul. We are first and foremost an education school, and a special shout out, she's in the back, but our acting dean, Jenny Tooten, who is tirelessly doing a wonderful job. All of you are professors, and you know sometimes when you look out at the room of 18-year-olds, I like to look at our new students and tell them there really was a Thomas Hunter. And what's a wonderful story, he was kicked out of Ireland because he had ideas that were too progressive. He came to this country, and his first move was to say that girls, really 14-year-old girls, should not graduate from school and then turn back up in the classroom in front of the room about a month later. That the teachers deserved true professional training, that they deserved 2 years of content knowledge, which was highly progressive at that time, a year of pedagogical training, and like a doctor, a clinical experience, which is why we have always had a lab school, now famously known as Hunter Elementary, and of course added a high school. So we started as a normal school. We started as a school with a great commitment to education and to educating the great population of New York City in the 1870s. So the problems that you're discussing tonight, the issues of particularly integrating immigrants and immigrant families into the public education schools and rising to that challenge, is something that we really cut our teeth on in the 1870s and are so very, very proud to be part of this conversation, the work we've done, but proud to be part of a conversation now because the problem continues as the immigrant community in our city grows and the challenges to our public schools are considerable. We're so happy to host this important conversation in our East Harlem building because you are also part of a conversation that we're having with this community. When we moved to East Harlem from 79th Street and had our social work school here and brought up our School of Public Health, we made a commitment to this neighborhood, not just to bring a lovely facility, but to see if, as an academic institution, we could move into a neighborhood with many challenges and get it right. If we could see if we could spend the next 15 years engaging with the community, listening to the voices, and helping to create a community here that was better educated, healthier, more socially and economically secure. And it is through conversations like tonight, the research that you're doing, the problems you've identified, the solutions that you're helping us find, that we want to bring this back into the community to help the people of East Harlem reach those goals. So it is our history and very much our current work that we're doing that is really engaged in tonight's conversation. So I am extremely happy to have all of you here. We're very happy to have our own Brian Collins on the panel. And it is wonderful to bring David Steiner back up to the podium, where we're sorry that you are no longer officially, but you're always part of the family. So welcome, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, everyone, for coming out on a somewhat wintry night. This is a critical conversation for the country and for the city, as Jennifer said. It is a long story. It didn't start this year or this decade. It's the fabric of this country. But I think what we have seen in the last few decades is somewhat new, and that is an increasingly bimodal distribution of opportunity for our immigrant families. This is in some ways becoming worse, as you will hear. Both those who are among the most successful of our citizens and too many of those who are among our most disadvantaged. This is, I think, not only tragic for those who are disadvantaged, but actually is an enormous challenge for our country as a whole. It is a microcosm of a deeply torn social fabric, which imperils, I think, the American dream and the American experiment. I think the work that you'll hear about this evening is critical for two reasons. One, it's deeply interdisciplinary in the most serious sense. That is, it does not respect academic boundaries in the identification of problems, because problems don't come packaged in academic boundaries. And we need thinking right across those frontiers if we're going to get this right. The questions have to be pursued, the challenges have to be pursued through multiple avenues of inquiry and through multiple possibilities. And secondly, what comes off powerfully in every page of this report is how little we know. There is a really important research agenda that is suggested in these pages that we've got to dig into. And we can't afford to ask the wrong questions because there just isn't the funding, the opportunity to ask every question. T.S. Eliot once talked of the idiot questioner. And I think there are fewer idiotic questions in this report than almost any I've read, which is an enormous tribute, I would say, to the authors. It's, yes, take five. When I finished, I wanted to sort of call up every foundation I know and sort of distribute the questions to each foundation, because teasing aside, these questions are critical. And the lives of millions really do hang in the balance. The poverty indicators that are in this research are really frightening. And the doors that close in children's faces because of their status is frightening. The last thing I'll say, just from my point of view, because it does connect to my own field directly of education, never perhaps in recent memory have state frontiers mattered so much. Many of you know that recently we had the new reauthorization of No Child Left Behind, a very, very major shift of authority back to the states. But in reading these pages, it's also very clear that your life as a first-generation American can be radically different depending on the state you call home. And that in itself is very sort of frightening to read, that we are not one nation for these children. We are 50, and in some cases, the life prospects are radically different depending on where you find yourself in this country. Well, without further ado, we have an extraordinary lineup. As people who've been at these events before will know, I don't read what you can read. The biographies are stunning. These are senior scholars of national repute. Hiro Yoshikawa will start, and then we will follow. No, you're going to start. I'm sorry, with different order. Carol Suarez Orozco will start, and then Hiro, you'll be second? Yes, good. So we'll reverse the order of the first two speakers, and then I think, Brian, you will be third, and Marielle will follow. So I'm asking the speakers to each keep their remarks to about 8 minutes. I will start gesticulating increasingly wildly as we move beyond that target. So, Carol, why don't you, Carola, start.
Good evening, everyone. I was told 12 minutes. Just for the record, so I'm going to try. So I will talk very, very fast and skip over some slides as I'm going. So I want to thank you very much for making the arrangements, but I won't waste words because we're going to try to get right into the substance. But I want to acknowledge our co-author, Vivian Tseng, who had a lot to do with the writing of this report. I mean, this is a co-constructed narrative, so we've all contributed to this. So every day, immigration is in the news all over the world. This is something we hear about constantly. It elicits passionate narratives from folks, and it can be viewed from many different disciplinary points of view: psychological, sociological, economic, religious, human rights, and that any one of those is appropriate. But today, my colleagues and I are going to discuss the children of immigrants. And the decision to migrate is never theirs. But the implications for their voyage has will have deep reverberations for schools, for institutions, as well as our society. Understanding who they are and how to serve them has profound implications for both their own well-being as well as the kind of society we will become. So just to give you a little bit of perspective, there are 232 million immigrants worldwide, foreign-born worldwide. That is, the curve is, you'll see, is significantly steeper. Over the growth from 1990 to 2013 has been significantly steeper in other parts of the world. So we're all growing, but in other parts of the world there's more of a growth. While the absolute number, so right now we stand at 41.3 million foreign-born folk. While the absolute number of immigrants is greater today than ever before, we've had higher percentages at other points in time. So as you can see, in 1910, at the other great wave, we stood at 14.7%. At that time, there were the similar kinds of concerns in the public imaginary. The nation could never absorb them. The worries at that time, however, were predominantly focused on and how we were going to absorb Catholics and Jews. And I want to kind of remind everyone that if you look at the Supreme Court today, every member is either Jewish or Catholic. So I think we did fairly well in absorbing over the course of time. So I just want to give that little perspective. So at the same time that immigrants have been growing, inequality has been growing all over. They're correlated. Remember, correlation and causation are not necessarily the same thing. Okay, right. So but at the same time, so inequality has been growing in profound ways. That's the inequality metric for the United States. So our GDP puts us in the ranks of places like Sweden and Switzerland. However, our Gini coefficient, which sort of measures inequality, puts us more in line with the USSR, Mali, and Sri Lanka. So the last time we were at this kind of historical inequality level was in the Great Gatsby era, right before the plunge into the Great Depression. I'm not saying that's going to happen right now, but that's what, I'm not an economist. I would never try to venture down that line. But, we had the same sort of inequality. So immigration's growing at exactly the same time that our inequality rate is growing. So that's the perspective, the frame that I want to give you. Now we're going to turn to children. So nationally, schools all over the country are encountering a larger proportion of immigrant students than ever before. In cities like New York City, Los Angeles, where I live now, the majority of students in the schools have foreign-born parents. But this is true even in places like Dodge City, Kansas. They're maybe not the majority, but they're 30%. So there's been this rapid growth. So in general, they're the most rapidly growing population. In 1970, children of immigrants constituted 6% of the population. They've grown to 25% today, and they're projected to be 33 by 2050. So that gives, it's not going anywhere. We have 18.7 million children now under the ages of 18, the majority of whom are second generation, which means that they're citizen children, for those of you who really care about those things. So, so what do we know and what should we know? The first thing I want to remind us, and I don't have time to give you all the data on and information on this, but we do know that on balance, immigrants come with a great deal of resilience. They bring immigrant optimism, the value of education, a work ethic, family cohesion, and a real strength of the importance of family, as well as the advantages of bilingualism. There's data that shows that the cognitive flexibility that comes with bilingualism is very important. There's a socio-emotional advantage, and there's even, with some languages, a marketplace advantage. At the same time, we could think of this as the best of times and the worst of times educationally. So it's valedictorians in many of our cities are often foreign-born. The Intel and Spelling Bee winners are vastly overrepresented proportionally. So on one end, they're doing incredibly well. On the other hand, we're finding many slipping through the cracks, graduating with suboptimal skills, going into community colleges if they go to community college at all. So what contributes to these patterns is basically, you can't give one answer. It's multiply determined. And it's in part, we argued in this report, can be accounted for by intersecting challenges, okay? Now, some of these challenges are shared by other marginal populations. And other of these challenges, they're shared by, and I'm going to go through them in a second, and which ones are shared. And then others are, and they're also, they kind of pile up on one another. So there's an intersectionality, and they're layered on one another. So what kinds of challenges am I talking about? Low parental education and work conditions, poverty, racialization. And then in terms of, and then there are other kinds of challenges that are unique to immigrant students. All right, they're not, you'll find them only in this population. What am I talking about here? Growing xenophobia, newcomer status, and the kind of social, emotional challenges that accompany that, undocumented status, and language challenges. So what I'm going to do in the next, 4 minutes? Yeah? 5? Oh, wow. Okay. In the next 5 minutes that I have, I'm going to talk about some of the shared challenges, as well as growing xenophobia and socio-emotional challenges. Okay, so I'm going to talk really fast. So we all know there's lots of evidence that shows that parental education has implications for their children's well-being. I mean, their educational trajectories, right? More education helps the kids. More parental less can be a detriment. It's not 100% correlated, but there's a high correlation. So in comparison to the U.S.-born population, the parents of immigrant students have a wide variability depending on the country of origin. So, for example, if I had a click point, I do have one. Let's see if I can make it work. Well, the 24.4%. So on average, the U.S.-born population, 24.4% go to college. If you look at, and I just picked a sampling of countries here. This is courtesy of Ruben Humbau and Alejandro Cortés. So Indians and Chinese, look at their rates, significantly higher than the U.S.-born population. Then we have a group of folk who are on par with the U.S.-born population. Jamaicans, Vietnamese. And then we have other countries of origin that have significantly lower rates. Their parents have significantly lower rates of education. It's quite striking in a slide like this. And of course, there's wide variability. Not everybody who comes from Mexico has low education. Not everybody that comes from China has high education. Our colleague Vivian Louie has done wonderful work on uptown versus downtown immigrants and how their trajectories of their kids are quite different. So, but this is just on balance right there, a snapshot on that. Then there is variability in work conditions. Immigrants are going into the majority of our immigrants are going into 4 sectors: manufacturing, agriculture, service, and the knowledge sector. The work conditions in the first 3 are clearly quite different than the knowledge sector. But I just want to remind you that 24% of our scientists and engineers and with BAs and 47% of the folks with doctorates are foreign-born. Just to give you a sense. But there are huge different implications for the kids' outcomes. So then there's a big difference in just there's a disproportionality in the likelihood of living in poverty. And now I'm going to fly through these stats. 24% of children with foreign-born parents live below the official poverty line. If you use a more generous cutoff of 200%, of the 200% poverty line, 51%, slightly over half. Roughly half are uninsured. And but you should know that children with foreign-born parents are less likely to use food stamps, so that's the upside from one point of view. The downside is they're much more likely to report rates of food insecurity. Okay. And lastly, I'll mention that immigrants are much more likely to live in urban centers where the cost of living is much higher, so those figures should be kept in mind. All right, the other point that I'd like to make is that increasingly immigrants are racially diverse. Most are coming from Asia, South America, as well as Africa and the Caribbean. Thus we're finding that they're encountering, and even though we're becoming more and more of a majority-minority space in some states, the power and wealth is not evenly distributed. So in this transition period, there's a lot of tension. So they're encountering various forms of bias, structural discrimination in housing, work, and schooling practices, racism, the classic racism that I don't have enough time to go through, and then microaggressions as well, which we can talk about in the Q&A, as well as increasingly xenophobia. And with xenophobia, we find that there are four particular kinds of stereotypes that are coming about. One is they're invading our borders, and that they're all illegal. And then I put illegal in quotation marks because that's not the term I would use, but that's the term that's out in the rhetoric. They're taking our jobs. They won't learn English, and therefore we're going to be forced to change, and they are criminals and terrorists. And these are sort of the narratives that if you listen to the political discourse, you see floating around a lot in the media and elsewhere. And so the question is, what does that mean? And I'm on my last slide and about to transition to Hero. So the question is, what does that mean for development for kids who are hearing these narratives about themselves and their loved parents and family members? So that's a question I put out there. I think we can think and talk about that. Then for newcomers, in addition, they have another set of particular challenges, which I look forward to having a conversation with my colleague moving forward. So they have the challenges of adapting to a new land, which we could talk with at length, but with time allowing, I'm not going to do that. Issues of acculturation. They also have very high rates of family separation. In the study that we did, 75%, with 400 immigrant kids coming from 5 different countries, we found that 75% had been separated from 6 months to 10 years. So separations are normative, and those of you who study social work know that that has implications for well-being. And schools are often not attuned to working with these kids. So that, that's where you find the tension. So, and I'm happy to talk about some of the practices that might be helpful in the Q&A. So, and then another form of structural inequality, I forgot to do your, so another form of structural inequality that has keen implications for well-being is undocumented status. And for this part of the talk, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Hiro Yoshikawa.
Thank you, Carola. I wanted to clarify one thing, which is that the report that we're summarizing is available on the website of the William T. Grant Foundation, and our co-author, Vivian Tseng, who Carola introduced, is a vice president for a program at the William T. Grant Foundation. And it's actually part of a series of papers on the Foundation's website about different forms of inequality and their impact on youth development, with an emphasis on implications for both research and policy. And so there is no topic right now that is drawing more attention with regard to policy, including, of course, in the upcoming presidential election, but even in this last year of the Obama administration, and I'll say a little bit more about that, as the issue of unauthorized or undocumented status. We, in this report, are using those words somewhat interchangeably. It essentially means being without papers. There are many, many forms of visa status, actually, in the United States. There are now somewhere between 30 and 40, and one of the trends in American policy towards immigration over the past 30 years has been an increasing proliferation of visa statuses. But if you actually look at the main statuses, what has happened is this area of undocumented status without any route to citizenship has grown over the past couple decades, with increasing restrictions on any kind of pathway to citizenship in federal policy, particularly, I mean, overall since 1986, but particularly since 1996. These are the numbers, and you'll see reflected a steady growth in the numbers of immigrants coming into the United States or transitioning from various visa statuses to unauthorized status. But you see that the numbers showed some declines since the Great Recession. And what has been interesting, for example, is that the net migration across the US-Mexican border is now in the southward direction, whereas up till the Great Recession, it was in the northward direction from Mexico to the United States. So just some basics. The unauthorized are not eligible for health care benefits in publicly provided health care benefits except for emergency care and childbirth services in the United States. The undocumented, as well as those who were eligible and enrolled in Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which is a temporary reprieve from the threat of removal and deportation for those under 31 with certain kinds of educational backgrounds. This is an Obama administration executive action that was passed in August of 2012. Even those recipients are ineligible for services of the Affordable Care Act. So the research shows much higher rates of wages below the minimum wage, fewer workplace benefits, lower autonomy, and higher hazards in work. So the very worst work conditions in the United States are experienced by the unauthorized. There's lack of access to in-state tuition in many states. New York actually allows access to in-state tuition, but does not allow access to in-state assistance for tuition. And there's been a big push by the New York Immigration Coalition and others to try to address that so far have not succeeded at the state level. There's a lack of access to driver's licenses, but 10 states and DC allowed this in 2015. Newer even than when we put these slides together, Texas has been restricting the forms of identification in the last year for parents to get birth certificates for their children. So we see some fairly extreme forms, and I think, as David mentioned earlier, a great deal of state variation. So with places like Texas being examples of some quite restrictive policies, but California being a particularly positive case of multiple policies to try to integrate this most marginalized set of groups. So not only in-state tuition access, but forbidding landlord ordinances that essentially do not allow any access to stable housing for the unauthorized, prohibiting mandatory use of E-Verify, which is an electronic employee verification system, which, if implemented without actual formal work permits, will generally, the threat is that that would drive the unauthorized further underground and further into the kinds of workplaces that have the worst work conditions. In California, so this is to give us a little bit of a positive story with this topic, but the undocumented camp practice law and other professional licensing boards are starting to consider all applicants regardless of immigration status. But certain other actions, like allowing legal permanent residents to serve on juries or undocumented parents to vote in school board elections, are still blocked in California. So if we turn to kids and youth, which is really our overarching topic today, over 28% of children of immigrants have at least one unauthorized parent. So we might think that this is actually a very small population. This is an enormous population. That is over 5 million have a parent who's unauthorized, and of those, over 4 million are U.S. citizen children, leaving about 800,000 who are unauthorized youth themselves. So that's important to keep in mind. So if we go first to the issues facing children and youth who are unauthorized themselves, Roberto Gonzalez of Harvard has done some of the most eloquent writing on this, about this, what it means developmentally to transition to the awareness that you are unauthorized. And for many youth, this happens at a point when they are about to embark on normative transitions. So their friends are starting to talk about college. Friends are starting to get driver's permits. Friends are starting to transition to work. All three of those normative transitions in mid to late adolescence are blocked for unauthorized youth. Now, it varies again depending on the state. So if you happen to be in a state with in-state tuition, your path is actually not blocked. But in fact, many social workers, for example, unfortunately, or providers might not know some of these, or educators might not know all the intricacies of state-level variation, and so they might, and we have youth reporting these in the research, occasionally feel like, oh, they don't have access in places where they do have access. New York is one of those states, and so it is very important to communicate if this comes up. Of course, we're not in the business of asking youth their legal status, but if these worries come up, to reassure them about the forms of the fact that in-state tuition is available in New York, and I think that's particularly relevant here with this audience. We're within the CUNY system. So this developmental awareness occurs very differently for different youth who are unauthorized, and some, again, who have the supports, who are in the more certainly friendly states, who have family supports, who have school-level supports. Those kids, Roberto Gonzalez observed in a 15-year study, are doing quite well. On the other hand, those who face blocked opportunities, who have lower levels of those supports, were doing much less well. They were actually isolating themselves from friends. They were hiding their own status from peer networks, and therefore withdrawing from engagement in these normative transitions, things like thinking about college or university. So more likely to drop out of high school, for example. And certainly mental health issues that go along with that. If we turn to the U.S. citizen children and youth, this is over 4 million in the United States. We see some evidence of risk to these kids. There's mounting evidence that there is actual harm being caused not only to the youth who are unauthorized, but to the U.S. citizen children of unauthorized parents. So in early childhood, lower levels of cognitive skills. In a brand new study, lower levels of academic achievement among 7 to 10-year-olds. By adolescents, in middle childhood, also higher levels of withdrawn and acting out behaviors. By adolescents, higher levels of anxiety and depression. By young adulthood, a whopping 1.25 to 1.5 fewer years of schooling, which is an enormous effect, and that's accounting for some of these selection factors. And there's actually a new book by Frank Bean and Susan Brown and Jim Bachmeyer called Parents Without Papers from the Russell Sage Foundation that I can refer you to, that summarizes a bunch of their studies around this issue. And then for those families that experience detention or removal proceedings, the effects are drastic on kids' behavior problems. By definition, the deportation of a parent, all of the income of that parent is lost to that family. There are permanent parent-child separations, which have even more drastic effects, of course. And in some cases, kids moving to countries of origin of their parents that they have never experienced and are having transitions due to being part of a culture, a language environment, schooling environment that they have never experienced. And those are studies by Heather Kobol from the Urban Institute, A.J. Chaudhry, Randy Capps from the Migration Policy Institute. DACA is a temporary reprieve, and those are the eligibility criteria. Over 500,000 have been enrolled, but that is actually nowhere near 100% of those who are eligible. But preliminary evidence from Corolla, Robert Teranishi, Marcelo Suarez Orozco's work, and 2 other large-scale studies by Roberto Gonzalez and Juan Valdivia, national studies find that DACA recipients experience major I would say kind of jumps into a more integrated life within U.S. society. So new jobs, becoming banked, opening bank accounts, getting driver's licenses, still locked out of federal and state financial aid for college in most states, and of course the tuition, in-state tuition, that also varies for this DACA population. And interestingly, very high levels of worry and anxiety about family members, largely about family members who are still unauthorized, and so fears about deportation. And in fact, even higher in some studies, rates of anxiety and worry than non-DACA recipients. And very troublingly, and maybe Corolla can talk more about this too, the students in her study, college students, report discrimination from 3 sources, from peers, faculty, and university staff. And in a recent panel at NYU with the New York Immigration Coalition, there was also this reporting of staff really not being prepared in educational settings to understand what opportunities are available to unauthorized students. Okay, I'm going to now turn it over to Brian around the issues of language diversity and language learning.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here with you today here in East Harlem and to present with Corolla and Hiro and Mariela. What I'd like to do is highlight some of the language learning aspects that were brought up in the report and discuss ways that schools are handling these rapid demographic changes that Corolla presented to us earlier. So as 81% of all immigrant children come from homes where a language other than English is spoken, the majority of immigrant children are bilingual. And so language learning, English language learning, is a huge aspect of their life. And navigating multiple languages represents both an opportunity and a challenge for these students. So I'm sure many of you have tried to learn or have learned another language and realize that it doesn't come easily. It takes a tremendous amount of effort and perseverance. And this is true not only for adults, but for children as well. So while some aspects of language learning may come quickly, the social aspects in highly contextualized settings, learning the more academic types of language that are required to perform well in school takes significant time. Most research has shown typically around 5 to 7 years. So children need the time and support during these critical years to learn the new language to be able to succeed in school. Compounding these challenges, immigrant children often come from lower socioeconomical households and where parents have lower levels of education, as Carola highlighted, and they also typically attend highly segregated schools with limited and inconsistent services. So as a result of these factors, children who are English language learners tend to perform significantly lower than their non-L peers on academic performance indicators, graduation rates, and transitions to college. So this particular report is especially important as it presents the multiple dimensions and layers that are connected to the wide discrepancies and inequalities that children of immigrants face. Furthermore, the research on immigrant children demonstrates sometimes counterintuitive findings. This is especially the case when it comes to dual language learning and how children best learn multiple languages. Of course, the home language environment is particularly important and plays a large role in the language skills that children bring with them to school. The quality and the quantity of language being used at home, that is, the types of conversations that children have with their families, the number of books at home, and the language that they speak with their parents and siblings are all highly related to their language abilities. So there's been a stubborn misconception that families should speak more English at home to better support their children's English language learning and to speed it up. While in fact what the research has demonstrated is that more of the home language should be used at home. And this results in better outcomes, not only for language proficiency in that home language, but also for English and later academic outcomes. Families that do, immigrant families that do use more English at home tend not necessarily to demonstrate higher English proficiency, but what results is a lower proficiency in their home language. So these critical home language experiences are lessened and weakened by using more English at home. And so this report, in highlighting some of these findings where perhaps more English doesn't relate to more English, is critical to help form our recommendations to families, but also the work that we do at school, because the same is the case at schools. Schools that incorporate more of the home language as part of the instruction have higher outcomes in the home language and in English and in academic outcomes. And so rather than trying to immerse children exclusively in English and take away some of the strengths that they bring with them to school, it's best to build upon these strengths and use home language to support their learning of complicated concepts as well as their English learning. So oftentimes schools try to begin just at step, as though children are coming in as a blank slate at step one, to begin with the basic English learning. And this is occurring at the younger grades as well as the older grades. But immigrant children bring with them a wealth of abilities that should be built upon. And the home language is a key factor in accessing and utilizing, leveraging those strengths and abilities that children have. So in terms of schools in New York, we have some of the widest linguistic diversity here in the nation in New York City. Children of immigrants head to school each morning from homes that speak over 600 languages. Spanish makes up the majority of these languages. You can see, I'll try perhaps, if I can, nope. I don't want to switch to the next slide. So you can see up here on the top that Spanish represents about 65 or 70% of bilingual children, with Chinese at around 14% and growing numbers of Bengali and Arabic. But these are the 13 most widely spoken languages in New York. And oftentimes, they're within a single classroom, children will be coming from families that speak languages from 3, 4, maybe even 5 of these different languages. The way that schools are supporting these, well, to back it up, federal and state guidelines require that schools identify and provide services to English language learners. So within New York State and New York City, typically the way that the schools are providing services to these students is through instruction of English as a second language, where children have a specific classroom where they learn that's focused on English language learning, or a support specialist that pushes into their classroom. And those represent around 76% of the programs. This is 2010, 2011, of the schools across the boroughs of New York. So that's the wide majority currently is within ESL. Transitional, besides ESL programs, we have bilingual programs. Transitional bilingual education programs, where the goal is to move children as quickly as possible into English mainstream programs, represent 19% of the programs. And then DL, which is dual language programs, where instruction is provided in both the home language and in English, and the goal is to support both languages for as long as possible so that they're fully developed. These represent only around 4% of the programs across the schools. So there's roughly, I think, currently around 120 programs. As many of you may be aware, the current chancellor has new initiatives to increase the number of dual language programs in the schools in New York. Here in East Harlem, I think in District 4, there's roughly between 10 and 15 programs that are dual language. I should note that programs themselves don't necessarily equate to the quality of education, because you could have a strong program in any one of these. But overall, what we see nationally from meta-analyses and studies here within the city is that the dual language programs are producing the higher outcomes for children of immigrants across the board. And that's not only just for language abilities, but also in these academic discrepancies of graduation rates and standardized test scores. The dual language programs are supporting students the best. So hopefully we will be seeing higher increase in those programs. So in terms of how we prepare teachers to work with this rapid and substantial demographic change in the school population is extremely important. Not only for teachers that are working within the bilingual programs or the ESL programs, but for math teachers and special ed teachers, art teachers that will be working within New York City or in Kansas, because the likelihood is that with between 25 and 30% of all children coming from immigrant families, that teachers across the nation will have immigrant children in their classrooms with these language learning needs. So change is coming very slowly in the schools. How we train teachers, how we educate our students, the curriculum that we expect our students to perform, the tests, all of these things, as quickly as we see the rate going up of immigrant children, the rate of change in the school has been a slow creeping change, and because change does not come fast. But it's incredibly important that we incorporate the way that we support and prepare new teachers so that all teachers will have the strategies and understanding of how to best support immigrant children. Likewise, for current teachers, developing professional development towards working with children of immigrant. So at Hunter, we have a few projects ongoing towards this end. One is the CUNY NYSIB project. We're currently working with over 65 different schools across New York City and the state as well in providing professional development on the specific strategies on how to use home language support within instruction and resources for the students to further develop their skills. Here in East Harlem, we have the Reed East Harlem Hunter College project, which is working with young learners to develop those early critical language oral skills that are connected to their literacy and reading. So those are some recent initiatives. Mariela is going to be talking about other ways that we're supporting the immigrant population within East Harlem in just a moment. Are we going to do the policy implications of the report next? Yeah? Okay. So before going back to just some of the implications of the report, I just wanted to highlight where the report can be found and encourage all of you to download it and read it. Thank you.
You can kind of guess who worked on what in this report from a little bit of a tag team approach. So just 2 slides. So don't clap afterward. So one on policy implications and one on research implications from everything we reviewed in the report. And I think Carola is also going to be able to go into more detail around and Mariela, I'm sure, around the practices within school settings and other kinds of contexts. But we emphasize these aspects that Brian raised around ELL instruction, practice, and assessment, but also talk about the kinds of socio-emotional supports that are vital. And so linking this area of socio-emotional learning in schools, which I think doesn't really consider often these issues of diversity and immigration, and considers the sources of socio-emotional challenges and strengths of youth to be primarily the same across these groups. And we think there's actually a need for some real specificity around the challenges of newcomer youth, but also of second generation youth and third generation youth, and some of those issues around either racialization, xenophobia, the stereotypes that children of immigrants and immigrant children experience. In post-secondary access, there is a tremendous need to, since children of immigrants are disproportionately represented in the less selective colleges, particularly children of immigrants from low-income backgrounds, and are showing then lower rates of retention and completion. So we think there is a critical need to investigate and develop reforms around post-secondary access, but then retention and completion. There's a set of, so that's a set of kind of school and education system focused policies that we wrote about towards the end of the report. We also have a set that we're focused on what can be done to support families, immigrant families. And we think that we don't understand enough in this country around how anti-poverty programs do or do not work differently for immigrant families. Part of the process of acculturation and integration into the United States is also understanding the complex policy systems of the United States around its very targeted approach to a safety net with different criteria for programs like Medicaid and food stamps and the EITC, other kinds of tax credits, childcare subsidies, after-school programs, what we have in terms of the public provision. We think there's a great need for supporting parental education-focused interventions. The research shows that when you improve parents' levels of education, when they participate in educational activities, there is a strong impact in improving children's learning. And that happens for a variety of reasons. Parents are serving as role models. When the parents do homework, I work on a dual generation program like this in Tulsa. When parents are doing their own homework, the children really observe that. And the parents are also aware that they're modeling these behaviors for kids. Then centrally around these issues of unauthorized status, of course, the most fundamental route to this is comprehensive immigration reform, which would provide a pathway to citizenship. Remarkably, a large proportion, you wouldn't know from the media debate or the public debate, but the large proportion of the American public supports a route to citizenship, and that is across both parties. That's not that well known, but there is a disconnect between the public opinion and the policy discourse. And so I think there needs to be more work around this issue of framing and communication that goes beyond the us versus them approach of particularly unauthorized immigrants to one that draws more on the concept of integration, incorporation, and the we in American society. Right now, as you might know, the Obama administration had proposed an executive action to extend this temporary reprieve from deportation to parents, unauthorized parents in the United States, called DAPA, and extended the DACA program in a variety of ways to reach more of the that population, those who came as children before the age of 15. Tomorrow, the Migration Policy Institute will release a new report on the numbers of unauthorized parents in the United States, so I urge you to register for that webinar. I'll be the discussant on that one. I think it's an extremely important report. It's meant to inform the current consideration by the Supreme Court of the DAPA case. So various states, including Texas, have blocked implementation of that executive action, and the Obama administration has taken that case to the Supreme Court. And so over the next few weeks, we'll find out whether the Supreme Court actually accepts this case and whether this would be a major part of the last year of the Obama administration. And so for that, we do need accurate numbers of the number of unauthorized parents in the United States. So I can't say anything about that report, but I urge you, it's 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. You can look at it on the Migration Policy Institute website for the link to the webinar. So in terms of research, it is a little shocking. I'm not going to read all of these things these are in the report, but it is a little bit shocking that the National Census stopped collecting data on generation of immigration in 1970. And I was recently on a National Academy of Sciences committee where we, again, I think many researchers have noticed this and are trying to press the United States government to collect this very, very basic information. You don't need a lot of questions. It gives you an enormous amount of information if you can collect where were you born in the United States, were your parents born in the United States, what countries of origin. If we were able to more consistently integrate that in all local data sets, whether you're studying immigration or not, we have diverse samples in all of our studies. That's the number one recommendation I think we need to make. And then assess more of these policies, anti-poverty policies in the United States. We have no idea what the effect, the differential effect is for most of these on kids of immigrants. So we need to do more of that policy evaluation work. We need to understand how newcomer families experience policies. What do they experience when they are trying to enroll in SNAP for their kids, when they are trying to access mental health services, when they are trying to learn about the tax system, unauthorized or getting taxpayer identification numbers and paying taxes. How does that process occur? So I think that's it for our summary of the report, and I'm going to turn it over to Mariella, who's going to tell us more about her work in Harlem and East Harlem in New York City.
So I'm here to talk about how we serve an increasingly diverse student population, specifically students of immigrant origin and also students who may be at the intersection of other inequalities, right? And so that's just the reality of the students that we serve at the Harlem Educational Activities Fund. So the Harlem Educational Activities Fund is a college access and success program that serves students from the start of the 6th grade typically all the way into college completion. And so the idea is that we serve students that may not have access to educational resources at their school, or maybe don't have enough resources to take them to the next level. And so it's the idea that we somehow are providing those supports to our students to really develop a love for learning and a love for learning's sake. And so I come to this work from a very personal experience, and that's because, you know, I share a very similar background to some of the students that I work with, and I feel like that really enables me to get to know my students and to really be a source of support for them in many ways. So one thing that we do at HEAF is we really try to build a student culture where we support our students holistically, and we manage the varied needs that they may have. We also coordinate with other departments to support them through social emotional learning, and also to provide them with a college access support. And so we've noticed that with many of our students, many of them have many risk factors and many things that may, you know, traditionally put them at risk, whether it's homelessness, whether it's custody issues, whether it's, you know, language acquisition, support that they're not receiving at their schools. And so we really try to be a source of support for them in that way, and to kind of mitigate those issues and to provide them with, you know, sort of a bridge towards resiliency. And so some of the things that we do is that we really emphasize the idea of cooperative learning, where we see all of our members of the community as valuable assets to any classroom setting, right? And so we want to acknowledge all the wealth of knowledge and experiences that they may have and may possess that generally does not get tapped into in the dominant culture. And so one way that we do that, or that we encourage that, is that we want to make sure students are interacting with one another to really build knowledge and to really become comfortable in their own skins. And so something that we tend to do in our courses is they tend to be focused on project-based learning. And so it's the idea that we want our students to be more socially aware while also learning content at the same time. And so an example of a class, or an example of classes that we've offered in the past, are classes that look at acquiring statistic knowledge, or knowledge of statistics, but also connecting that to some of the larger societal structures, like income distribution across subway lines or across subway stops. Or maybe we're learning about superheroes, but we're learning about the physics behind those things. And to really drive it home for them and get them to be critical consumers of the knowledge that they're receiving. And so another thing that we tend to do with our students is that we tend to be that source of consistency for them. And so many times we notice that our students may be going through issues at home, maybe have a change of demeanor when they come into our space. And we somehow have to be in tune to those needs and to really figure out how to support them and take them to the next level. And so many times we've noticed that, you know, students come into our door and it may be the first hello that they receive. It maybe is the first high five that they receive during that day. And so somehow we have to really show them that we care about them and that we want to support them and that we want to take them to the next academic level. And so, you know, that's just one way. And then something that we do every semester is that we take our students on college tours. And so it's the idea that they get exposure to what that might be like, and to really imagine themselves and imagine another possibility for themselves outside of the community that they're in, or outside of the challenges that they may face in their schools. And so I remember one student specifically, we took them to Yale University this past semester, and he's really interested in engineering. And he never really had a chance to see anybody in the real world be really into that and just be into it for the learning's sake. So he got to meet an affinity group at Yale called the Bulldog Racers, and they got to develop their own vehicles. They talked about the engine that they were building, how fast the cars would go, and this boy's eyes lit up, and he came back into the classroom with an increased passion and dedication for learning and for wanting to be better, because he imagined a different outcome for himself than would have otherwise been accessible to him. And then something that we've noticed also is that we can't automatically assume that we know best for our families or that we know best for our students just because we serve them or just because we see them for a few hours each day. So something that we do when we get to meet our parents or our families is that we really invite them to talk to us about their goals for their kids and figure out how we can best support them in that capacity, because ultimately they're the experts when it comes to their children, and we just need to provide opportunities, maybe resources to get them to that next level that they may not imagine as a possibility for themselves. So I'd be happy to talk more about other issues during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Our time is limited because of the richness of the presentations. So I'm going to ask each person if there's one thing that should have been said, that they wished had been said, that wasn't. And you don't all have to speak. And then I'm going to turn it quickly over to the audience. Anything that, I think you were particularly rushed by me, so I want to give you.
I would like to just remind everyone, I think we talked about a lot of negative issues, and there certainly are many challenges of that immigrant children face, but they are remarkably resilient and resourceful, and with the proper supports, many of them do very well. So, I think we have to sort of, it's not all dark, and trying to understand what makes a difference is what is critical.
I think what was fascinating was the multi-layers of the analysis, right? From the national policy to what we do tomorrow morning with a particular child.
I'll say one more thing. And the other thing is, I think that the reason why there has been so little research is in part because we have played ostrich to the growing population, but also I think it's because it's so complicated. And there are so many layers, and it's very easy to dig in deep to one little aspect of it. And you can't look at it all at the same time. So I think that's been one of the challenges for this kind of research. And when we did this, collectively worked on this report, we were trying to parse it out as neatly as it can be parsed, such a messy issue and set of problems. Because to do good research, you have to really dig in deeply into a sector and then try to understand where it all fits in the greater whole.
Let's open it up to the audience. Questions for any members? Yes, please.
I think Mr. Collins mentioned in terms of those models, ESL, TDE, and dual language. Did I hear correctly that the DL appears to be supporting the students best? And if so, my question is the schools of education, are the schools of education looking at these outcomes and modifying or looking at their teaching so that they could prepare the educators to really implement or, my father used to be an ESL teacher and he was trained years ago, and now I'm hearing the dual languages, so I'm curious to see, are the schools moving in that direction or addressing it?
Right. So, like politics, which are highly connected to the policies that we create for our students, the pendulum swings. And so when we saw a high increase of bilingual programs in the 60s and 70s in New York, the pendulum swung back in the 80s and 90s, and many of those bilingual programs were replaced with English-only programs. Fortunately, we're seeing, and I believe it's a result of the increased focus and research on these types of programs, that the dual language programs, as you say, are producing higher results. And they're popping up in the strangest of places. Utah, strangely enough, has, I think, 10% of its programs are now dual language programs. Today, I saw a report from Fox News posted from Manhattan on dual language programs and how fantastic they are. And of course, they are highlighting the benefits for families that speak English and are sending their children to dual language programs and learning an additional language and placing themselves in a higher marketplace and opportunity. But what's good for the goose is obviously good for the gander, and so it's encouraging that there is a new mandate, I'd say, from the chancellor, but from the state as well, with public funds going to have teachers, current teachers, come back for bilingual extensions, funded to receive additional training on top of their current licenses. The projects that I mentioned to you are publicly funded as well to go into the schools and incorporate that. But a lot of work needs to be to be continued and built on. But it is encouraging that that there is a push now to increase the number of dual language programs.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, Utah is not unusual because of the Mormon Church.
Yeah.
The highest level of
Multilingualism.
multilingual
Yeah. Speak to a Mormon.
white
Right.
so it's not,
No.
But my question is if you take children, immigrant children at risk, and you had the one chart that showed the Chinese and Indian heritage, subcontinent heritage, have higher parents have higher educational attainment. If you went and did a chart about the children most at risk, would you find less in that category and more where parents are have lower education? And do you see higher documentation amongst those parents who have higher educational attainment rather than parents with lower educational attainment? So is that all linked together?
No, they're not linked in those as, yeah, we certainly didn't have the room on the slides to put all of the patterns up there. So within these countries, there are countries of origin, there's a great deal of variation. So there's a large low-income wave of migration from China, for example, alongside, so within the very same flow from a particular country, you can see that. Within the East Asian region, families with backgrounds from certain countries like Cambodia, for example, or Laos, or are showing much lower levels of education. The Hmong, who are an ethnic group that actually cut across multiple country borders in Southeast Asia, are another example, and those kids are struggling. And again, particular groups, you can see a great deal of variation among them. If you look at the unauthorized, roughly 60% are from the country of Mexico, but that leaves an enormous variation across the other groups. Central America is probably the next set of countries that represents the most, but there are substantial subgroups from places like China or India or Korea and Europe. So I think it's very important to recognize the variation, and both the issue of who are the unauthorized in the United States, and you could look at that through reports from the Pew Research Institute, Jeff Passel's work, or Migration Policy Institute.
Can I quickly push you to the heart of, I think, what the question is? Are there any examples of groups who come from very high poverty backgrounds who are outperforming the expectation that would lead you to assume?
Well, it depends on what you mean. If you look at it across generation,
Yeah.
If you look at it across generation,
Yes, then yes.
then absolutely. In fact, most immigrants do.
Right.
You know,
Yeah, you do well.
Mexicans, for example, you see how, as a group, again, there's variation, but as a group, very few, 4% have parents with a college education. By the second generation, you see higher rates than that.
Right.
So if you compare them to where their parents are from, they're doing really quite well. If you compare them, to other folks in this country, not so well.
Right.
So it's what are you comparing against?
Right, got it. There's a question over here.
Hi, Jeff Ginsburg. I run East Harlem Tutorial Program, and actually we've done some work, David when he's Hunter, and we've started some teacher residency stuff, and it makes me think about, are we at an unprecedented point in which the teaching workforce does not, in terms of immigrant status and racial status, represent the students that they're teaching? So if you took that graph and you looked back through the years, in terms of where we stand, would it look like this the whole time? Has it changed? Because I know even in where we are in East Harlem hiring hundreds of teachers working through this, it's just an extraordinary struggle, and I assume it's even worse maybe nationwide.
There's definitely a mismatch between our teaching force and our student population. If I understand correctly the question, are you, with this mismatch, are you talking in terms of background and
Well, so in the solutions piece, we didn't talk
a lot
about that. I'm just wondering if you look
Right.
back over the history.
Sure.
I kind of have a pretty good sense, I think, of what it is now, and a lot of us look at that, but I'm wondering historically.
Well, in terms of solution, historically, I'm not able to answer the question completely, but I think in terms of solutions, it's incredibly important to recruit minorities and immigrants into the teaching profession to work within the schools, shared backgrounds. But at the same time, it's critical that we educate all of our teachers to be able to work with a changing population. I think that that's a more reasonable or achievable way of approaching the problem, is that we can train all teachers to be able to recognize that the population is different. Currently, we're in a, I guess, historical moment in the sense that so many teachers are teaching as though the student population was the same as it was 30, 40 years ago, or this is how I learned. And so
we have a double problem. The percentage of people going into teacher education has dropped almost 30% in the last 5 years, nationwide. Yeah, and that's stunning, and that's across the entire country. Though it's absolutely devastating in California, where it's much higher. And in fact, there are cities now where they simply can't find teachers. San Francisco has a major crisis. So you've got a general problem, whether it's the impact of the improved economy plus some of the policies that pushed, yours truly included, towards accountability that made the profession appear less attractive. We're not sure, but the effect is very dramatic, and that only makes the racial diversity challenge that much deeper, because we're not seeing any increase in that regard.
I just to add something, because I think it's really important to this general conversation. I agree 100% with you, Brian, that we have to be addressing the current teachers, whoever they are. We need to be doing a better job of doing teacher training, both for new teachers as well as teachers who are in, already in the trenches, if you will. And I've taught at three major education schools, and I was always the first person who was addressing this topic. So, so that's kind of an interesting point. The other thing that I wanted, from the historical point of view, if you think about the last Great Wave, 1890 or to 1910, 1920, right before the Great Depression, a lot of those immigrants were Irish and Italian. If you think into those kids were not doing well in school in general. There's all the hand-wringing we're doing right now. Who was the teaching force 2 generations later? Go to Boston. Who were the teaching force? Mostly Irish and Italian.
And are we going to see that again?
Yeah. Well, that's.
It doesn't look like it in the data.
Well, I don't know. I think that if we looked at, I guess the optimist in me, the one who looks at the half full glass, thinks that it can happen. I mean, if we continue to play ostrich and we continue to do all the wrong things, then probably not.
Okay. Other questions? Yes, go ahead.
So you've done a few programs on the Common Core, on the implementation. There's a lot of emphasis on teacher training on that. And is that emphasis on what teachers are learning to keep up with the standards, to learn the standards, to teach the test, to what extent is that stopping them from addressing this issue, and to what extent is it helping address this issue? How do those two tasks for teachers intersect?
I guess I'll take this one.
We may not agree on this one.
Common Core is a set of standards around skills. And the great challenge with the Common Core is it isn't about curriculum. It isn't about knowledge. And when you measure skills, the risk is you try to teach to skills. because you teach what's tested. The more you drill underprivileged children on skills, the more the gap between their performance on skills tests and middle-class children's performance on skills tests increases. And so the great risk here is that unless we inform teacher training colleges that content is the escape route for the least privileged children, that is, the more they know, the more they'll think critically about what they know, we will lose this. In fact, my prediction is that unless we have a major press and push for content-rich curriculum, the achievement gap will widen under Common Core. Because it turns out there's no such thing as reading a text without knowing something about the world. I could give you a line about British cricket, which however educated you are, you couldn't understand, right? Because you don't know the content of the game. So there's a high risk with Common Core that it actually further disadvantages the groups we're talking about if we don't do what was done, by the way, for my mother's generation and my grandmother's generation in New York, which was the mixing of cultures into a very content-rich education. There was a lot of learning of content.
And I think you bring we did disagree. So, you bring up a very important point around the kind of the content knowledge in this. But the other point is the linguistic disadvantage on tests. So, second language learners take, many years. 5 to 7 is the best data to get to the point where their academic English is up to par. I'm not even convinced that they're taking tests.
I mean, one of the things we failed to change was that we test ELL students after 2 years, right? And then we're surprised when they do badly.
Yeah.
That's very
just
silly.
not ready for prime time.
Right. They actually do much better. Many of them, after 5 to 7 years, outperform the natives.
Yeah. We just have to give them the time, and we should be looking at their improvement against themselves, not against the standard of a normative.
One more question before we close. Yes, Peter, loudly.
My name is Peter Goodman. I write a blog called Ed in the Apple.
Nice.
There are some very successful programs in New York City. For example, the International High Schools Network, which there are 15 schools, and they have almost the same graduation rate as all other children. What are they doing that makes them those successful?
Funny you should ask. I actually had a series of slides about them. So they do. I had a series of slides about them that I didn't have time to do.
Now's your moment. Make it quick.
Make it quick. Well, it's hard to say. They do a lot of things really well. They do, in some ways, I want to look at my notes so that I get it all right. So some of the things they do is what we want for all of our students, right? It's not, you don't have to be an immigrant to want to go to one of these schools. They emphasize relationships, they emphasize rigor, they emphasize, a strong curriculum. But they also, they also support the socio-emotional needs of their students. They recognize that these kids are going to need those kinds of supports, and they have groups for the kids. They write about these issues, and then they use English as the language of instruction, but they allow the kids. It's not an UNS initiative type of English, which is punitive. Punitive. English is the common denominator language, but the kids are constantly speaking in different languages and working between each other, and they've really done a great job of figuring out exactly how to do it. So I have many more points about what they do, but in a nutshell, those are.
They also train teachers in residency programs, which we've been associated with. So the teachers, many of whom end up being hired by those schools, have been immersed in the school culture. And are not just spray gunned into the schools, which is our normal stupid pattern. Well, a rich discussion thanks to the panel. Thank you very, very much.